Good morning. Thanks for the invitation. I'm going to quite specifically talk about network projects I've been involved in. Trans-European projects, some of them funded through European grants, others not. But I thought, obviously, or maybe hopefully in this context of today, it's maybe good to hear a practitioner how those projects work on the ground. So I'm starting with the opening image showing the two publications that came out of those two EU cultural funded projects. One is called Urban Act and one is called Translocal Act. They've both been initiated by a practice in Paris called Office for Self-Managed Architecture, Atelier d'Architecture Autogérée, and one of the main people there is Doina Petrescu, who's also the head, she's a professor of architecture at Sheffield University. So the projects are not strictly within a kind of fine art context, they kind of breach into architectural practices, activist practices, and wider kind of public practices, I guess. So Urban Act, they're kind of collectively published, open copyright. They're distributed through the network of the people who've been involved in it. So you buy 2 copies with a promise to give one to someone else. The Urban Act book is mainly a reader of different urban practices across Europe. From, I don't know all the countries that were involved, but from many Central European countries. And the second publication, Translocal Act, is a reader about projects, but also ideas, papers, research that looks into what we could call a local cultural production. Where do we start looking when we look at local cultural production? And what are translocal ways of dissemination or networking or exchanging? So that's more specifically about the methods and the realities of producing locally and diffusing translocally. I can leave the books here over the lunch break. I wanted to show some of the maps because all this networked activity, everyone who's involved in it knows how complex, interesting, amazing it is all the time. It hardly ever gets located or noted. Who is involved where, for what reason, from which background, and what's the transformation within the process of networking. So AAA keep doing those incredible diagrams of noting everyone who's entered the network, for what reason, how long have they stayed in the network, where has their ambition moved to from maybe coming in as a, don't know, painter moving to activist, or coming in as a public art officer moving to gardening. So they're kind of making quite careful notations of who is moving in those networks for what reason. And for this book, Urban Act, with each practice that's portrayed in the book, there's a diagram that shows the spatial reach, the kind of geography and the networks involved in the practices. And that gives quite a good understanding of the organizations, but also of the nature of networks. I mean, they don't reproduce very well, which is a shame. But you can have a look in the book. That's one interesting ongoing diagram of AAA in Paris, where they've worked on a very local project in their neighborhood where their office is over many years. And they had very local participation, straightforward local participation in building a collective project. It was called EcoBox. Residents getting involved for different reasons in making this big public space centered around the idea of a community garden. But they also constantly brought in all their kind of networks from elsewhere, students from Sheffield and other kind of urban activists from Berlin and so on. So it's an extensive mapping of how the kind of translocal connections feed into very local discussions and activities and vice versa. So it's kind of trying to draw this loop between the local and the non-local or translocal. As I said earlier, the translocal book specifically looks into this as a practice and the various methodologies. And this was what are they called? The big corporation grants, like 7 partners involved. Turkey, Germany, Netherlands, England, France, and a mapping of all the activities that were looked at. I thought maybe I have to map out a little bit the territory in which I network. Small words, big meaning, urban, rural. 2 quite important terms that represent the field where I see my work and where I'm moving. I live in London, and I come from a tiny village in southern Germany. I'm involved in 2 collectives. One is called Public Works. I have been involved with Public Works until last year. We are artists and architects, mainly with kind of a practice in an urban context, what I've described earlier in Urban Act. And I leave 2 books here that show you some of the projects that Public Works does. And the other collective I'm involved in is myvillages.org. It's a foundation registered in the Netherlands. And again, there's more publications about my villages here. So both practices have been going on for quite a while, 10 years. And then the networks immediately associated with my villages are 3 major cities, London, Rotterdam, and Berlin, and 3 tiny villages. And the reason for starting my villages in 2003 was that we met as colleagues who have this kind of participatory urban practice in cities. We would meet in Madrid and Mexico City and Berlin. And somehow the obvious, but something we never thought about it before, was why was the urban always the presumed territory for what we are doing? Why would we never ever consider the rural, unless we had a commission, as the field of practice? So that was in like 2001. And we tried to find a curator to do a really amazing project with us. No one was interested. So we're like, okay, fine, let's make our own organization, much stronger probably anyway. So it started with visiting our own rural backgrounds to discuss how much they could be a territory or a field or an area for our practice. So we did quite funny things like walking through, so it's 3 of us. Yeah? So that's Antje, who lives in Berlin, comes from Heiligendorf. Wabke, who lives in Rotterdam, comes from Jeltrup, which is in the Dutch Friesland. And I come from Höven, I live in London. So we walk through my village, 200 people the whole day, take a few photos, what artists do, discuss. Go to the pub in the evening, and then Wabke, in this great way, announces, God, we've been working really hard all day. And people are like, yeah, really? What have you been doing? She's like, we took at least 8 photographs and we talked a lot. So there was a nice cultural clash about what work means. But we are very confident about how hard we worked the day. The network that was or is associated with Public Works comes automatically out of a more urban context. People come from Düsseldorf, Tehran, we work in London. A lot of our colleagues have practices in cities, so it is immediately connected to a more urban environment. 2 other terms which I find useful to locate where I work is the local and the translocal. And then what goes through all the projects is the idea of networks, however permanent, random, or intended they are, and objects that come or are produced through those networks or make those networks.
Sorry, what do you mean by translocal?
The exchange between 2 local situations. And 2 other terms that are quite important is the idea of exchange and trade that comes with working in those networks. So I wanted to show 2 projects that were part in those European networks, but are also running independently. One is the International Village Shop, fairly self-explaining what it is. That was self-initiated, and it's ongoing since 2006. There's a website, International Village Shop. It uses a methodology I've developed with Public Works, which is collective product development. You get a group of people together, not necessarily a formalized group. You get I don't know, park users together and think with them about a product that stems out of their shared experience or appreciation of a place. So that's my village. That's the no. It's an important annual event. It's the village fete, and there's 2 public events. The church service on the road, which is nice. It's a kind of Catholic Reclaiming the Streets project. And then everybody goes to the pub. And there's nothing in between. When I started working with my villages in my home village again, I thought, okay, let's have some other public realm on that day. So I had the idea of running a kind of village shop, a stall, where you kind of trade things and you have this other space and trade. So I started working with the women in my village. That's a different relationship. It's my village. And they feel very obliged to work with me. In the same way, I feel very obliged to contribute to every single village fete. I've done all the stage painting, I'm accepted as an artist, I can do other stuff there now. They meet once a month to have coffee and cake. And I came in and I said, want to do a project? Yeah, fine. I've not once mentioned the word feminism. I will do when I'm brave enough, soon. It is a feminist project. I invited the women, roughly 25 who meet for coffee once a month, to think of a new product to sell at this new market stall during the village fete. And of course, the question is like, why? Why would we do this? Why do we need that? Why would we get involved? Blah, blah, blah. Who might buy it? And so on. However, out of this sense of obligation, the group got together. And we started workshops around what the village holds, what is a local culture, what do women do when it comes to village fetes? Do they always have to make jam, or can we do something else? Who's representing the village? Who is telling the stories about the village? Can there be new ones? How romantic are our memories? And so on. So there were probably 3 sessions where we just talked about what people thought the village was, what a local resource, tradition, culture was. And of course, all those things are very, very blurred. There's nothing as a local tradition, because I've been away for 13 years. I lived there last year for a year, and suddenly there's a new tradition. I'm like, well, when did that start? And they're like, it has always been here. I'm like, no. I lived 13 years ago. It hasn't been anyway. So I think this idea of local culture and local tradition is something to be very critical about, but something maybe also to play with. So the idea was that we develop a new product together, something quite stylish for this first village fete, to compete with the church service and the pub. And we had sessions, and the sessions were so much more also about, why do we do this? Why would we like to invite a new product? There's so much stuff. And then there were some agreements on it has to be functional, which is very much part of a kind of rural identity. Things have to have a use, which of course is so critical because our houses are full with stuff that are very functional but never used. So we agreed on this, okay, functions. We played with the identity of the village, the kind of local identity. We are called the frogs, just because there's lots of frogs in the meadows surrounding the village. And I wanted to produce something in porcelain which refers to quite a strong regional porcelain manufacturing industry where a lot of the women had worked on very low wages, kind of in shift jobs. So we came up with this product. So useful. That's my empty slide. So now here, you have to look here. Yeah, I will. So it's a spoon. Comes from that story that a frog falls into a pot of cream, can't get out, needs to swim until the cream turns into butter and the frog jumps out. So it's a cream spoon, a butter knife, and a print for the frog. And it's made in porcelain. So we had it. Everyone was fairly happy. I also invited a product designer friend from London in. Again, that's for me quite important to make those translocal connections. So it's not just me going back to my home village. There's also like networks I work or make use of to connect back to this village. We had it, we made it, the first village fed, and then like, no one's gonna buy it. And how much could it cost? And suddenly a discussion about value, which is like ridiculous, right? Like, oh, 10 euros? No. Suddenly everyone pretending to be really poor in the village, like, no. Can't 10 euros. Anyway, so we had a big stall in the village hall. We launched a new product. We sold everything they would normally sell, like jam and fruit and craft. Also had a photo exhibition, and then launched with a new product. It's a bestseller. Okay, we only made 100, but everybody, of course, had to buy one. People wanted to buy more, but it's not the done thing. So there was like some trade going on after the shop. Like, can I have 10? Because I don't really want to show off in public that I spent 100 euros. So quite interesting discussions around, well, local identity, local resource, manufacturing value, and so on. I give it around in a second. The spoon is quite a good thing to describe a certain method and process and dynamic. So I use it quite a lot. I brought it as part of this translocal act. And I think there's something about why I used the word object earlier. There's something quite strong about objects to play a role in a group to talk about themselves, about their agenda, expressing it maybe in a slightly different way than normally. So it's this group of pensioners. They're called Forever Young. Also a very kind of women-dominated group in Ballykinler. And so they wanted a spoon. The story there, of course, is a very different one. And again, that's where the translocal becomes quite interesting. To bring stories from a Northern Irish village back to like my Southern German village, where they have like no idea of the amount of conflict a village might actually still have. You know, it's not all post-Second World War, there's actual conflict in some communities. So those links become then important when the products travel. Anyway, in Ballykinler, this group, we talked about what product, what do you want a souvenir, what do you want. They had this thing that they were so fed up with local politicians for not getting a community center. They just landed a caravan in the village and decorated in this like really quite nasty way, like flowers, you know. Like. So Christoph Schäfer started calling it the cozy aggressiveness. Quite a confident act to like just come in, put a trailer in the middle of the village and declare it a community center. So we thought actually that's something, that story should probably be represented or retold through the object. And then there's like some kind of more everyday taste in quite a few gardens. And again, that would be something that everybody shows you when you go to Ballykinler on the tour of the village. You would definitely be shown those pots. So the product idea was born fairly quickly. It's a flower pot in the shape of the caravan with the same cozy, aggressive aesthetics. So with each new collective local product, there would be a local pop-up shop for a day during the village fete. And also then alongside other stuff that's being sold or traded in the village anyway. But the products also enter this kind of translocal network of shops. So the caravan pot would then go, in this case, to a museum exhibition in Switzerland, where it was suddenly the bestseller, which then kind of goes back to Ballykinler and disbelief. But those stories, because they're so linked to those objects, can be told fairly easy and then kind of cause a different discussion. So just quickly about the shop. So the shop some of the time takes place in rural non-art places. Some of the time it takes place in exhibitions And in this case, it was an exhibition about art and craft. Takes place in a museum which is part of an old monastery complex, which is now a civic foundation, and they still run the estate as a self-sustained agricultural estate. So we said, okay, we do the shop there if you commission a new product from that place to go into the shop. And again, like the spoon would be there, and the shop is kind of a weird neighborhood of things from all quite peculiar local well, obviously local places, but like tell quite peculiar local stories. And a lot of the objects have a short film, like a 5-minute documentary, which is based around stories of handling and making it rather than language, so they can actually be shown across language borders quite easily. And there was one very, sometimes I think of like the moments I'm really proud of in my practice. There was one moment when we launched the films at the Royal Academy in London, which sounded grand enough for 2 women in the village to decide they come to London, Royal Academy, you know. They came, and they didn't have to come as tourists, which they probably normally would have done. They came to attend the launch of the film they're in. And they came into the Royal Academy, and someone said, I've seen you. Like, no, it's not possible. We come from this village first. And somehow not realizing that the film had been screening for days on end already. So this shift of roles and in relation to a place is something I really appreciate when it happens in the work. So they didn't have to come to Royal Academy as a kind of German tourist from a village looking a bit like not so informed. They could come into this exhibition being a co-producer in this film, and this like shift of roles and how you enter and visit places. And that's the current website. The website of the International Village Shop is just, it's an archive of where the shops have been. And the traveling products, we call the kind of collective products, the traveling products, and the kind of local products. So this idea of local, translocal. And the shops can be kind of fairly designed and set up and very ad hoc, which is nice. Also to play with this idea of setting up shop, playing shop. Shop is quite a low-key, everyday, familiar format to then talk about something else and show something else. So we have 1-hour shops, 2-day shops. That was a shop in California, and again, a spoon was sold, which again is good news, you know, in the village. And suddenly you have international relations, which didn't have before. That's a permanent shop in a small veterinary clinic in Friesland, and there's just a small selection of the shop classics, and the films are running in this waiting room. And then that was a pop-up shop at Tate, one of the later Tate programs. And that's one of the stalls during the village fete in my home village, which is then staffed, you know, like everybody kind of gets involved. Briefly wanted to talk about Economatic School, which is a different EU-funded program. It's funded through Grundtvig, which is the adult learning program. Has a completely different language attached to it, how you suddenly have to describe your project in the funding application. But it's a program that focuses on allowing individuals to travel across Europe. Not those who are professionally involved in the networks, but maybe the women from Ballykinler, maybe the women from my village. So the Economatic School, again, has been initiated through this Paris-based office, Atelier Autogerie d'Architecture. Agency are involved, University of Sheffield, my villages are involved, and a small community foundation in Bresoi, which is in northern Romania. And we've just finished the first round of this network and applying for a second round. And the first round was very much about visiting places, understanding the context, and looking at some local projects. So that's the village in Bresoi, which is, of course, half smallholding, half communist housing estate. And sometimes just to understand the variety of rural realities in Europe is quite something. To understand that when we talk village or rural, the national differences or cultural differences can be still so big that it needs a lot of research to understand it. So and though this econometric school was really about traveling, for my taste, a bit too many field trips, a bit too much talking, but fair enough. I'm probably just a bit overdosed on it. But again, to be there for 3 days with quite a varied group of community gardeners, people who would describe themselves as housewives, teachers, quite a range, not just around art. What was amazing in Bressoy was to understand, obviously due to like the economic situation, how much food and produce is still produced within a family, and things I can get quite romantic about, of like, oh wow, they make their own yeast, and they're like obviously not too happy that they can't just buy it. So again, this kind of translocality in those projects is for those involved to become aware of differences through being allowed to compare things directly. So the whole economic school is really obviously learning by doing, learning by listening to each other and just visiting each other's places. And the project in Bressoy, quite specifically, has to do with odayas, which are tiny small holdings in the mountains. And economically, they're linked to each small holding in the village. Each family would have an odaya to complement their kind of annual production of food and produce. And they're derelict. There's hundreds of them in the mountains and no one is using them anymore. So in a way, econometric school allowed for a very different network also of expertise and ideas to come into this very local project and bounce off ideas or present ideas that probably wouldn't have been generated locally and weren't so appreciated locally. Suddenly people come in and say like, well, do you really need another odaya? Why can't you, very, very different ideas, where then you have this clear conflict between we are from here, we know better, and what's your external expertise going to do here. But I think because it's a mutual project, everybody obviously wants to acknowledge and is quite happy to acknowledge very different opinions coming into those local situations. That was the Paris site. It's called Rourban. It's a project run by AAA, and it's to set up 3 collectively run places within a suburb. One is urban agriculture, one is kind of recycling, reuse facilities, and one is collective living. And the idea is to implement this as a kind of circle of interaction within a kind of suburb of Paris. So again, that was a place we would all go to with different ideas, learning how to build dry toilets. Those are always my favorite photos, kind of international collection of spirits. And this kind of standard of like reclaimed bottles. The Fanta is of course a classic. That's like deadly Romanian schnapps. And again, typical image, everyone sitting around PowerPoint. But then I think if you're not working within this cultural networked field all the time, it is a cliche, but it's also a situation that is quite precious to have the time to sit around, look at something and just talk about something. And then the whole network moved to Germany, and I quite like this photo. So there's the German, well, obviously not there's a car with a German number plate and a car with the Romanian number plate. And the one I organized in connection with my home village and the women again was around rural women's economies. How have farmers difficult? Yeah, there's no feminine form of farmers. It's always the farmer's wife or female farmers. How have women in rural environments have been involved in economies? What kind of economies would they have traditionally, and what new initiatives are there? But again, we used something quite common ground, which was white cabbage. And the Romanians brought theirs. And it looks also similar, white cabbage, but then by slicing and chopping it, everybody understood those very subtle differences in the type of plant, but also in how to chop it. And then the women from my village would make sauerkraut. And we would go to a few places in and around the village with this international visitor group, which now I've done it the third time. Everybody's getting a little bit used to it, but the first time there was complete perplexion why anyone would want to come to this village for more than 2 hours. Yeah, so again, one of those classical cultural tourist photos. We walk through the village and have a look at it. But it's quite important for the village to also look at this image in front of them, like a lot of people in very different outfits walking through the village, discussing feminine economies. And we would have inputs from people who come from a more academic background in the network on kind of quite specific historical facts or historical phenomena. So she's a sociologist with a specific gender angle on rural economies, and she talked about this old-fashioned notion of husbandry before division of labor was taking place within rural economies and so on. And then there was some non-language based knowledge exchange, how to preserve apple juice. And again, the final image, bit of schnapps from Brezoy and some health drinks from Franconia. The International Village Shop is continuing. It's a continuous project, and so is the Econometric School. We're hoping to get new funding for the Econometric School, but in the next phase to focus more on workshops and maybe producing at least prototypes, maybe for new products or concepts in each location, which then can feed into the International Village Shop. That's it. Thank you. I'm really bad in concluding those things. I'm really bad. I think the example I used earlier of 2 of the women visiting London in this different capacity or different role is important. What they do with it, I don't know. It's not a very positive village. They're very down about themselves all the time. My father is constantly declaring this project a dying project because everyone involved is over 60. Excluding me. There's huge dilemma about getting the younger generation involved, which then makes me realize that what I still know as a public village life doesn't exist as such anymore, which has to do with the general privatization of our lives. Life seems to be much more organized around family and private, small public spaces rather than the general public space. So in that sense, it doesn't have a positive impact yet. It has very kind of pointy impact. Like one woman gets involved who's really into kind of alternative medicines, and this is not an alternative village. It is conservative, middle-class village. So she gets constantly laughed at by everyone that she's pursuing some weed remedies. So suddenly a network like this, where others come in who maybe use alternative medicines for very different reasons or from very different backgrounds, gives a kind of context for her to explore it, not just as a personal hobby, but within a kind of wider cultural context. And I think that's important. And there's a few other women who kind of pursue things that the village finds quite laughable, like still having cows and making your own butter. So I think for them, this bigger network is quite meaningful. Because then by comparing what they do to what others do and the reasons for why others do it, just gives you a completely different framework to think what you do and why you're doing it.